Last week, as we looked at these kind of two very familiar miracle stories, feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, we talked about how kind of behind those stories, was this overall image of Jesus coming to shepherd God's people. It took our cue from when Jesus sees the people on the hillside, he has compassion for them because they appear as sheep without a shepherd. And so we went back, looked at Ezekiel 34, and that passage of how God was taking issue with the shepherds of Israel at the time and their failure, and God's promise that I will come and shepherd my people, and how Jesus is fulfilling that promise. And so we kind of read especially that feeding story through the lens of God as shepherd, providing for God's people, causing them to sit down on the green grass, all that imagery that we talked about last week. And so tonight, as the Pharisees re-enter the picture, and as this growing conflict between the religious establishment and Jesus becomes more and more apparent, I think that's still the image we are to have in mind. This idea of what God had hoped for the shepherds of Israel to do when God charged them with caring for the people, versus what they've actually done and the way they've actually behaved, because I think that helps us as we get into these stories in Mark chapter 7. So, beginning with first verse of Mark 7, it says, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law, these were the folks who are supposed to be shepherding Israel, right? The Pharisees are essentially kind of the local pastors. The teachers of the law are those who are supposed to be helping people understand how to live their lives. So these are supposed to be the shepherds. The Pharisees, some of the teachers of the law, who had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and 'Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death.' But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. Okay. So, just to kind of get our head around the situation, we're dealing here again, and this has been an ongoing theme in Mark's gospel, between the law itself, the written law, the law of Moses, and the direct interpretation of that text, and the oral traditions that have been built upon the law, the halakha, the kind of oral interpretations and traditions that have developed. And so in this particular case, what the Pharisees are talking about is what is developed over time out of an initial requirement within the law for the priests to ceremonially cleanse themselves before they go in to present a sacrifice, before they go into worship. And so from that basic item of the law, traditions have layered upon them. And Mark gives us this parenthetical. I don't know how many of your translations do this, but most of the more modern translations will mark verses 3 and 4 with parentheses. Does yours do that? Most of them will. Because scholars kind of understand what's happening here is Mark's telling the story, but then there's this parenthetical aside where he's explaining why this is a problem. And he says over time this tradition is developed, and the Pharisees and all the Jews, that might be a little hyperbolic. It might not be all the Jews, but the tradition of the Jews following the Pharisees. Here again, another traditional kind of way of thinking was, if it was good for the priest, it's good for the people. And so if the priest did it, the people should do it. So if the priests wash their hands, the people should wash their hands. And so there's this ceremonial idea of washing their hands before they eat. Now, we read this as modern people, and we think, of course you should wash your hands before you eat. You know, this is not, to us, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? We really should do that, and we spend a lot of time teaching our children that and admonishing them when they don't do that. But this is a little bit before the discovery of microbes, all right? So we're not dealing with sanitation or even proper etiquette. We're dealing here with tradition. And what the Pharisees are asking Jesus is, why don't your disciples follow the tradition? Now, I don't know at this point if somebody's following them around to see if they wash their hands. You know, I don't really know. There is, by the way, when we look at slightly later in some of the Talmudic text, there are some indications of particular procedures for how one washes their hands. You're to cup your hand and pour the water in the hand and then let it flow through, which, again, we would say that doesn't really qualify as washing your hands, but it's ceremonial, right? It's the idea of cleansing to receive and put something in your body. And so Mark makes it very clear. They're not challenging Jesus or the disciples on a matter of law. This is not a matter of them breaking God's command in this way. It's a matter of tradition, and they're not following the tradition. So Mark goes into this thing about, they had a whole lot of this kind of stuff. I mean, that's basically what the end of verse 4 is. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, cups. Mark's is basically, they're always worried about this kind of thing. So the Pharisees asked Jesus, why don't you live according to the tradition of the elders? Now, maybe the issue is eating food with defiled hands. Maybe it's something else. Maybe the issue basically is, why is it every time we encounter you, you're not following our traditions? Here's another one. We caught you in another one. Why is it that you won't do what we do? So Jesus says, Isaiah was right about you hypocrites. You know, great thing about Jesus, he didn't pull punches much. And we understand the meaning of the word hypocrite. right? I mean, we know it's to say one thing and do another. The literal term is of two faces. It's a theatrical term, a mask with two faces. You've seen the comedy and the tragedy mask, for theatrical stuff. It's the idea that these are people who have two different faces. And they say one thing and they do another one. And Jesus says, Isaiah was right about you. And he quotes Isaiah 29:13. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. One way to look at that is to see the parallelism in it, and the first and third lines parallel, and the second and fourth lines parallel. And you can almost read them that way. These people honor me with their lips. They worship me in vain. Their hearts are far from me. Their teachings are merely human rules. There's kind of a parallelism here. And, of course, this is the primary complaint of all the prophets, if you think about it. Not just Isaiah. You think about Amos and Hosea, and time and time and time again, it is, you do the letter of these things. You give lip service to what I ask you to do, but your heart's not in it. You're not living in the spirit of what I'm calling you to do. And it's hypocritical, he says. You've let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. Now, it's one thing to sit here and be critical of the Pharisees for the washing hands rule and them challenging Jesus on that. Frankly, I think because they've run out of other things. Let's be honest. They've tried more serious challenges, and Jesus has rebuffed them. And so now it's like, well, maybe we can get them on, well, you're just not being decent, basically. It's one thing to do that with them, but then I think we have to start thinking about, where have we layered tradition on top of the gospel? Where have we layered in traditional expectations, traditional ideas? Where have the rules replaced the relationship? When I was growing up, there was the old adage that you don't drink, dance, smoke, or chew, or go with girls that do. Y'all ever hear that? And it was a rules-based way of thinking about faith, right? You don't do these things. You don't gamble with playing cards. So you don't have playing cards in the house. You can have rook cards in the house. Anybody play rook? Yeah. And people started, it's like, rook is like the Baptist card game. Because you didn't have to have, kings and queens and jacks and aces and diamonds and all that kind of stuff. It was an alternative to that. Now, I'm not saying having experience with this, but I have some idea that you can play poker with rook cards. I'm not saying. You heard. I just heard. I heard that's possible. I heard you could do that. So it's within our tradition, it's within our memory, right, that we layer rules on top of the gospel. That's what we do. Here's my question. Why did they do that? Why do we do that? And I think it's the same answer. Why do we do that? Why do we feel the need to add rules? Because Jesus says, really it's two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right? That's what Jesus said. Why do we do that? Why do we add rules to things? All right, so we can have our own way. Rules are a way of enforcing a particular perspective, a particular way of doing things. Sure. David?
It's a way for religious leadership to exert power over others.
It is. It is a way for religious leadership to exert power over others. And surely that's part of what's happening here, right? It's also what was happening, in all honesty, in, churches across the world for a long time and even in churches today. It's a way of controlling people, right? What else? We use rules to define community. So, all of you have at some point been in a meeting or maybe heard a sermon or in a conference somewhere where somebody starts off with the jokes about denominational differences, right? And you've all heard the jokes about, what's the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist? Well, the Methodists talk to each other in the liquor store. And the Methodist, you how to read. There's some people who say that too, but that's mean, Mike. What's going on in that? It's a way of defining community. We, whoever we is, don't do these things. These people over here do these things. I've had some interesting conversations this week. There has been more interest in Mormonism this week in Lexington than probably ever before. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but the new basketball coach at the University of Kentucky is a Latter-day Saint. He is a Mormon. And so I've had a lot of people ask this week, what about the Mormons? And where they always start is, I heard they can't have caffeine, which is a Mormon practice, right? They limit themselves from certain stimulants. Caffeine is one of those. But it's interesting that people start with, well, what can they do versus what can we do? It's almost like, is theirs more fun than ours? If you want to have fun, go be Episcopalian, okay? They do all the things. And I say that with two very good Episcopalian priest friends, and I tell them that too. Sometimes we use rules to define community. You're in or you're out based on your behavior. Last Sunday in sermon, I said there was a long time where the paradigm of church was believe, behave, belong. You state your belief, you learn how to behave, and then you belong. Instead of believe, belong, behave, or even maybe better, belong, believe, behave. But there was a sense in which you had to learn how to behave properly before you could be part of the community. And we're taking the easy way out here by talking about things that are funny and we've joked about for years. But there are also things that we don't think about that are rules to, when you walk into a sanctuary, how do you comport yourself? And what do we do when someone doesn't do that? We stare at them and we hope that Campus Watch will come to check on them, right? When somebody comes in and they don't look like they know what they're doing, instead of saying, can I help you? So often we're like, oh, they don't what? Belong, because they don't know how to behave. What the Pharisees are doing here, and I would argue what churches still do today, is this, it is David's right, it's an exercise of power, and it's a way of shaping and molding and controlling the nature and the scope of the community. Who's in, who's out. Rules are powerful to do that sort of thing. And so Jesus is rejecting that, and he's saying, look, what you're talking about is exterior stuff. I'm interested in the interior. And he uses a word here that he uses for the first time in Mark's gospel, the word heart. What you take into to your mouth. And again, Jesus is dealing with a first century understanding of human physiology, okay? Yeah, we know that what we put in our mouth can wind up in our heart eventually. We understand that. But it's metaphorical. He said, look, what you put in your mouth just is going to pass through your body. It doesn't change your heart. Heart being that center of being, the essence of who we are. That center of our emotion, our affection, our sense of identity. That's the way he's using heart here. He's saying these exterior things. He said, I'm not at all worried about these exterior things. He said, you guys have been focused on the exterior for a long time, and so you give lip service to your faith, and you keep all these rules, and you wash your hands, but your hearts. In Matthew, he says, you're dead inside. We know that part, right? You're like whitewashed sepulchers. You look great on the outside, and on the inside, you're dead. He said, you're following all the rules on the outside. On the inside, your hearts are not what they should be. Be more concerned about what comes out of the heart. Instead of what goes into the mouth, what comes out of the heart. And he gives that list of sexual immorality and theft and adultery and greed and malice and deceit and lewdness. And we're all, envy, and we're all happy with that list. And then he starts talking about arrogance and folly. And now suddenly we're all under conviction. Because we all experience some amount of pride and some amount of wastefulness with the opportunities of life. That's what folly is. It's wasting the opportunity of life. It's wasting time and gifts and moments and relationships. It's throwing that away. That's the definition of folly. And so in the middle of all that, Jesus gives this really interesting illustration. He says, let me tell you what I mean. You're so good at it, you could take the rules and actually have them overcome the law. And so he tells us this particular illustration. He says, okay, Moses says, honor your father and mother. Right? One of the top 10. Moses says, if you speak ill about your father and mother, you could be killed. Which is the negative statement of honor your father and mother. The do and the don't. Jesus says, but you know what you do, right? If you say this is korban, then you don't have to honor your father and mother with it. So what he's talking about here is to declare something korban was to declare it dedicated to the Lord. It was to say that this item or this valuable thing, whether it's money or wealth or a valuable item, is dedicated to the Lord, which means eventually I'm going to give it over to the temple. I'm going to give it, in our case, I'm going to give it to the church. And you set that aside and say, because that's dedicated to God, Mom and Dad, I can't use this to take care of you right now. I can't use this resource to meet my obligation to honor you as father and mother, to help you with what you need, because I've dedicated this to the temple, which, by the way the rule operated, you could continue to operate, use, own, whatever it was, until such time as you fulfilled that vow. So it's almost like saying, having a need where you need to take care of, in this case, a parent, and you said, oh, I would love to use this money that I have accumulated to take care of you, but I've actually set that aside in this trust for the church after I die, and so I'm sorry, I just can't help you right now. That's as close as I think we can get to that as an illustration. But Jesus is saying, here's the law, and in your tradition, not only have you kind of layered on top of the law and obscured it, you've actually used your tradition to subvert it and to avoid it. And that's where the hypocritical part gets in. You say this, but you do this. You've created this whole system. So, all that said, let me ask you a different question. Are all rules bad? We've talked about how rules sometimes are used in the church and community, how they can have a negative implication. Does that mean we don't have any rules? I'm going to leave here tonight. I'm going to get in my car. I'm hoping that other people have a certain respect for, although in Lexington it's questionable at times, a certain respect for the traffic laws imposed by the Commonwealth. That when my light is green, those other people are going to stop at their red light, right? I think we don't mean to say the rules are all bad. Fair? So how do we know the difference?
If you don't have some rules, you have chaos.
Right.
In your home, you have to have rules with your children.
Sure. Yeah. We have to have some rules. So how do we define, though, between the kind of bad, perhaps oppressive approach to rules and the good, healthy approach to rules? Ryan?
Yeah, the rules, just like bureaucracy, are there to point us to the greater good. They're supposed to be a means to a greater end, not the end in themselves. But we can easily become so distracted by them and think that that is, like Jesus said, like, what did you think? That you were created because God already had a bunch of great rules sitting around he wanted to enforce on somebody?
Right.
You know? And that's what you're here for. No,
Right.
they were there for a greater good. And what he says, like, you've got a heart problem, and I think, you know, when we look around and we hate each other when we're not keeping that rule that we love, it just shows that we love the rule more than the person.
Yeah.
And it's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be in service of the community to enable love to happen, not to enable hatred
Right.
and judgment. You know, so it's definitely a question of means and ends, and we're so messed up that we get enamored with the rule and forget about the person that it's
Yep.
about.
I think it's a really good way of thinking about it. I think it mostly has to do with this idea of the heart, right? Out of what does the rule come? Does it come for the sake of the greater good, as Ryan's talking about, as do traffic laws? We generally, although sometimes I think some of them are there just to annoy me, but I'm pretty sure that they're really there for the sake of greater public safety, right? For everybody's ability to move around and move around safely. However, you know, at other times, maybe there are rules that are by nature oppressive, that are by design oppressive, meant to control people or communities or certain activities. And I think we do have to be mindful of both the intent of the rule and then, as Ryan makes the point, our engagement with it. You know, so again, and this is, it's easy to do the mundane kind of illustrations, right? But again, with the traffic thing, everybody I know gets mad when everybody else doesn't follow the rule. So right now, those of us who are blessed to live in Masterson Station are experiencing a one-lane artery into Lexington because they're working on Leestown Road. And for the next 2 years, 2 years,
I feel your pain.
yeah, yeah, there you go. So what happens though, and this is where I find myself becoming righteously indignant from time to time, is when I'm sitting there at the light waiting my turn that I've waited through 3 times already because everything's so backed up. And then there are those people who pull into the intersection, you know who I'm talking about, and sit there. Now, there are big signs right now that says, do not block this intersection, yada, yada, yada. We will burn your car and, you know, confiscate your house and all these things. But they do it, and I get annoyed with that. again, what is our relationship to the standard? Sometimes we need standards. We have to have them in our home. We have to have them in society. What is our relationship to that standard? And at what point does annoyance cross over to road rage? I've always told Laura I wanted to drive a tank, and she says it's not a good idea. And I think she's right. I think what Jesus is trying to get at here with the shepherds of Israel is, how are you guiding the people? Because if it's good for the priest, it's good for the people. If it's good for the priest to have this relationship with these kind of self-imposed rules that obscure the law, then they're leading the people in the wrong direction. So if we as God's people don't understand how we're relating to God's expectations for us, and if we're using them to control the nature and shape of our community, then we're leading people astray as well. And so we need to hear the challenge of this. And so it goes from this conversation to a concrete example of it. And what I think for many people is one of the more troubling passages in the gospel, beginning with verse 24. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. I'm going to stop here for just a second. A lot of imagery here with which we become familiar. First of all, the woman falls at Jesus' feet. There's this, just by the posture, we know, right? She gets it. People, what did the Pharisees do? They come and they gather around Jesus. She comes and she falls at Jesus' feet. We have this imagery already that she kind of gets it, that she knows who he is. And then we have the idea that she is Greek. So Jesus has gone to Tyre, which is kind of up the coast, up the Mediterranean coast, out of Israel basically at this point, and in an area where there's a lot more Greek settlement. And it tells us that she is Syrian Phoenician. There were two Phoenicias in that point in time, and this is Syrian Phoenicia, which is north of Israel, and Tyre is part of that region. So is Sidon, is another city name that you hear from time to time. And so Jesus is now in not a fully Gentile region, but a mixed region at best, or people from both Jewish and Gentile backgrounds in this area. And so she's Greek, she's Syrophoenician, and she begs Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. Here again, Jesus is trying to hide in this house. We have this whole secret metaphor that we've been dealing with the whole time, and it just doesn't work anymore. He's trying to hide. He can't hide. They know where he is. She comes, she begs Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. Now, before I go any further, with everything you know this point about Jesus from Mark's gospel, what do you expect him to do? How do you expect him to respond? To do it, right? Woman, your faith. She's there falling. She's fallen at the feet of Jesus. She's begging him, your faith. He's done that for people who weren't Jewish. We were over in the Decapolis. We saw what happened over there, and now we're here, and we expect Jesus to do that. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Well, that's troubling, isn't it? That's not what we expect Jesus to do, right? Lord, she replied, I like this woman, by the way. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, "For such a reply you may go, the demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
What did he really mean?
Well, that's the question, isn't it, Marie? What did he really mean by that? What's Jesus doing here? What do you think he's doing? What is this about? Now, there's some ways that you read commentaries that they kind of try to mitigate the language and say things like, if these are house dogs, not street dogs that he's talking about, and what?
Purebred.
And these are high. These are like Coach Cal's dogs that have to be walked in a stroller. These are very high. These are high quality dogs. These are the house dogs. Children are messy, and so the bread fall off the children's table, and mitigating the language. And I get the kind of urge to do that because they want to say it can't be as bad as it feels right now, But if we just take it at face value, it feels troubling, doesn't it? But maybe, absolutely, Jesus has a sense of irony. And we can't read this story outside of the context of what just happened. Because what would the rule have said? The rule said no. The rule said no, you don't do that for her. She's not one of us. She's not why you came. First to the children, then to the Gentiles, right? She's not. The rule says no. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's putting the rule in a way that's offensive to everybody to finally make the point. It's not about the rule, it's about the relationship. But I love this woman is sharp. She's quick. Well, even, the dogs get the scraps, right? Now think about that for a moment in the context of Jesus' ongoing conversation with the Pharisees. In a way, what Mark is saying is that they left food on the table. The Pharisees didn't get who Jesus was. To them, it was like scraps falling off the table. It meant nothing to them. But there were plenty of folks who were hungry for it. And as we see the story of the gospel play out, that's what happens, right? It's constantly falling off the table of the privileged into the hands of the poor. Time and time and time again. And so it's supposed to catch our attention. It's supposed to make us go, wait, what? It's supposed to be offensive to our sensibilities. But it's not the heart of Jesus. Jesus is trying to point back at our heart. Jesus tried to point back at the heart of the Pharisees, saying, wait a minute. This is how you say, I'm gonna play along. I'm gonna do what you want me to do here. I generally don't, right? I don't make my disciples wash their hands. I'm going to give you this one. I'm going to say what you want me to say. But there's more wisdom in this woman than there were in all the religious leaders around Jesus. Right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of amazing, and because I think that's absolutely right that he's using a phrase that I bet other people use.
Sure.
And using it not in some ways to say, parroting, like this is how you talk, right?
Yep.
And so what's happening is interesting because basically they're assuming that they're the children and they're acting like the dogs, right? Fighting over these scraps. That was never the point. There's fighting over these scraps. And she comes as a dog, but it turns out she's actually acting like a child, as somebody who belongs, who wants to be there. And it's and she enters that kind of heart humility that they're completely lacking. And it just reminds me of some of those other passages which I
Yeah.
We're the children, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And
And the statement is, God can make children of Abraham out of rocks.
yeah,
Yeah.
and how he was like, you remember when there was a famine, and was it Elisha or Elijah went to only one, and it was that one woman, the poor woman with just the one son, was a foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
And they got all mad at him, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of reminds me of that, where here they have the sons of Abraham, and he's going to the poor foreigner,
Yeah.
and doing this kind of same thing. You know, God's looking for children, not for dogs. You know.
Right. Right. And it ties back to, who are my mothers and my brothers and sisters? Those who do the will of my Father. It is that idea of, and the way she comes, he says, yeah, you get it. For your response, he says. But what he's saying is, you get it. You get it. That's the kind of faith I'm looking for. It's done. What you asked for is done. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. A couple things here. First of all, this is an episode recorded only in Mark, which is really rare because, as you may remember from our early discussions of kind of the composition of the Gospels, that Matthew and Luke, the thinking, the common wisdom among New Testament scholars is Matthew and Luke use Mark as their guide, and so they incorporate almost all of the Gospel in Mark in what they record in their own Gospels. And so the fact that there's a story here that's only in Mark is really kind of interesting. And it begs, frankly, an unanswerable question. Why do Matthew and Luke leave it out? Why don't they include it? It's impossible to make an argument from absence in that regard. So I'm not going to try to do that. But it's curious that it's only in Mark. And it again has as its background another passage in Isaiah. So if we're paying attention here, if you're keeping score, we've had 3 or 4 stories that has their background Ezekiel 34. We had the last story that Jesus intentionally brings out Isaiah in talking with them before the woman, the Phoenician woman. And here we had the background of Isaiah 35. Maybe you remember Isaiah 35. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands. Steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come. He will come with vengeance and divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals lay, grass and reeds and papyrus grow, and a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go on it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Now, in the original context of Isaiah, this is about God's deliverance of those who would soon be exiles. They're not exiled yet at this point, but would soon be. In the later understanding of the church, this speaks to the Messianic age. And this is still the way we read it, because this is one of the lectionary assigned texts for Joy Sunday during Advent. Every third year this text comes up, because we understand this to be a description of what would happen when the Messiah comes. And so here we see what Jesus actually does in the unstopping. The ears of the deaf will be unstopped. How does Mark say it? His ears were unstopped. And then at the end, when they're amazed, he said, he makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. It's a reflection of this messianic prophecy that they would have understood at that time, or at least by the time Mark is writing. So here we see Jesus doing exactly something we expect him to do. But it's a little bit of an interesting way of telling the story. First of all, he's back in the Decapolis, back in those Greek cities on the other side of the sea. And it says, the people brought him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. It actually doesn't say he was mute. There's fine language here, but that he may have at some point been able to talk, which scholars, perhaps overreading the text, maybe, but at least indicates he may not have been deaf from birth. If you think about someone who could talk, but now can't very well, and they're now deaf, it may be that he wasn't deaf from birth, that this is something that developed because of illness or injury or something else, maybe just age. It's hard to say how that came about. But they brought him to Jesus to place his hand on him. Here we are with touch again. Remember, we read about that the last time, that they brought people just wanting Jesus to touch him. They brought him to Jesus just to put his hand on him. He took him aside from the crowd. Jesus is never doing what he's doing to incite the crowd. He's not doing it to build his brand. He's not doing it to create. In fact, he's constantly saying, don't tell anybody, all these things. But he takes this man aside. He puts his fingers into his ears. He spit and touched the man's tongue. And then he looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh, said to him, and this is Aramaic, Ephphatha, which means be opened. The phrase that I find really intriguing right there is and let me say this, it's not the mechanics of it. We see Jesus do similar things in the Gospels, make mud out of ground and put it on people's eyes and tell them to go wash. And we see this kind of interactive healing that Jesus does from time to time. And so the mechanics of it, I don't find surprising. Jesus is doing something that for this man who can't hear, how else would he communicate to him, I'm going to unstop your ears, than to put his fingers in and pull them out? Think about how practical that is. He can't tell him, this is what I'm about to do. So he's saying to him, yeah, I know these are stopped up, so I'm going to do something about it. Same thing with touching his tongue. If he can't tell him what he wants, what he could do, he's communicating to this man in the way he can receive it in that moment. And so that all really makes sense to me. The phrase that I find really interesting is it says, with a deep sigh, he says, be open. I'm curious, how does that strike you? What do you, when you hear that, what do you think? What does that communicate to you? Remembering here again, Mark doesn't like to give a lot of details. The fact that he includes that kind of interesting detail to me is important. Why do you think that is? What's significant about the fact that there's a deep sigh here? Not again? Okay. Barb? You don't have to raise your hand in here, Barb. You can.
I think he has empathy. I think that he just feels that this man has been through this for so long.
Yeah. So it's a sense of identification almost. Okay?
He's completed the job.
Okay, that he's completed the job in that moment. I'm obviously fulfilling this picture. He knows what he's doing, sure. That's all really good. I don't have an answer. I've been thinking, for 2 days I've been thinking about that. I don't think I'd ever noticed that phrase before in reading this passage. And it's interesting. And so I started thinking about, why do we sigh? You know, why do we ever sigh? You know, sometimes we sigh out of frustration, that kind of sigh. Sometimes we sigh out of a sense of empathy, out of an emotional connection with something. Sometimes we sigh out of relief, a sigh of relief that something has passed or something is over. Sometimes there's a reflexive sigh that when we get nervous or anxious, our body will take a deep breath and release that breath as a way of kind of trying to calm us down. There is an emotion in this, and this is what attractive to me. And I'm not sure I could identify the emotion, and maybe it's both frustration and empathy and a sense of relief all at once. I mean, maybe it's all together. But what I find here that's, I think, moving to me is Jesus has an emotional connection with this man in this moment. If we're not careful and we continue to read these stories and we just go back again and again, oh, well, Jesus cast out a demon. Oh, well, Jesus, this man couldn't walk and he could walk. This man was blind, now he could see. That almost becomes mechanical. Does that make sense? That if we're not careful, it could just be, well, this is the kind of thing Jesus does. He just does it. And so we pay attention to the mechanics, and sometimes we miss the emotion. And for whatever reason, I think Mark wants us to think for a moment about the emotion of this. And what I see Jesus doing here, even in the mechanics, are very caring things. Recognizing this is the situation this man is in. I can speak to him, but he can't hear me. I'm going to demonstrate to him what I'm going to do. I'm going to give him some way of understanding what's going to happen. And to me, the sigh is in some way to indicate that there's an emotional content to this, that it's not just a mechanic act.
I think there's also an emotional content to it because he looked up to heaven
Yeah.
with a deep sigh, contact with his
Yeah.
Father,
Yeah.
and maybe the relief that the power is there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And then it says the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. The need is met. Wholeness is given. And Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did that, the more they kept talking about it. And then you get this idea. It's ongoing, right? They're overwhelmed with amazement. He's done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. It's almost as if that was the last box they were waiting to check. Oh, we've seen him cast out demons. We've seen him give sight to the blind. We've seen him help people walk. Now he does this. Okay, Isaiah 30, Isaiah 35 is complete. We've now seen the whole picture. I don't know that that's true of the crowd, but maybe that's true for Mark as he's telling the story. Maybe this is his way of saying, hey, by the way, this picture, here it is. Now, this is not the end of miracles of Mark. We're going to see more of them when we get to chapter 8. But it's almost like he's done summarizing for us what's going on. It's now up to us to keep up, if that makes sense, as readers. Okay? Anything else? David?
I'm kind of wondering why it was that he lays low in London and then seeks around the northwest side of
Yeah.
the Galilee goes down to the Decapolis trying to avoid Herod's domain.
Yeah, he is avoiding Israel at the moment. He's not in Galilee hardly at all here. Yeah.
So he's laying low. He's trying to,
Yeah.
he's sort of. Do you think Herod has a warrant out for him, or do you think it just maybe after feeding 5,000 people, things were getting too hot, and he needed to lower the temperature of the clamor?
It's certainly, to me, what the text says indicates that Jesus is kind of trying to little of the air out of the balloon. I don't think he's so much running from Herod as he is, it's just too many people. It's too many people. And these are very individual moments. There's a huge difference, to my mind, between the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the Syrophoenician woman, which, I mean, don't miss that connection. Bread falling off the table, the scraps of bread falling off the table. There were 12 baskets of scraps left over, right? There are threads here. Those are two such different circumstances. I think, Dave, if I had to suggest a response, it would be that I think it's more about this need Jesus still seems to have to try to control the story. Don't tell anybody. Still, even after all this, thousands of people, they track him down everywhere he goes. He's in a house in Tyre, for Pete's sake. A long way from Galilee. They still find him. Marie?
He must to be extremely exhausted.
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah.
that's one reason that he went to this person's house, but they still followed him.
Yeah.
And then, the sigh could have been partly from, okay, one more today.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. If you look at the travel narrative, though, here, part of the point Dave's making is if you look at the map, you have Tyre is up here on the Mediterranean coast. I'm kind of doing this backwards so that it makes sense. And then you're coming down through Sidon, and where he's going is the north end of the lake. He's going, and Galilee is down here, and he's going over here to the other side of the lake. And so it is a sense in which he really is avoiding the Galilee for whatever reason at the moment. He's not back there. And we're not ready to head toward Jerusalem yet. Okay? Anything else? All right. Thank you all very much. Let me pray for us and we'll go. Oh God, forgive us when we layer our own expectations over the top of the gospel. Help us to remember that it is about your love for others. It's about our loving you with all of our heart and then allowing our heart to express your love to others around us. And to know when we do that, people's needs are met. People's lives are changed. It's the work of Christ ongoing in the world. Help us to do that as we leave this place. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Good night.